We're very happy to have Ashley Sanders from the National Move to Amend Steering Committee to talk about the movement, talk about what we're doing. With no further ado, here she is.
Basically, what I normally do is I think that history is powerful, A, because I'm a nerd, and B, because I think it is a story of how power works. And we need to know that story if we want to create our own story of how people power works in defiance of how elite power works. And so I want to tell the story of corporate power, which is a very, very long story in general, and I'm going to condense it into a medium long story, maybe. Move to Amend, which is a national grassroots coalition with over 150 chapters around the country, and a national leadership team of about 10 folks who are community organizers locally around issues of corporate rule, coming together to make some of the national steering decisions. We have democracy convergences 4 times a year in different places, and this year, luckily for you all, our convergence is in Portland, May 3rd to the 5th, and not, unfortunately, in Washington. So if anybody wants to learn more about Move to Amend and really dig in and learn organizing skills and get involved in the movement, it's a really great way to do that and to do in 2 days what often takes 6 months or a year. And so it's sliding scale. If you go onto the website, movetoamend.org, it will be up on one of the big banners on the website, and you can click that you want to go and show up with a bunch of folks. And we do trainings on the history of corporate rule. We do trainings on nuts and bolts organizing. We do trainings on anti-oppression work as part of our movement. And we do conversations and mingling about how we can strategize regionally on our way up to national. So that's the practical answer to that. And I'm going to start with an explanation of what Move to Amend is, and then take you through a history, and then we can have a Q&A, comment section, discussion. I'll move out from behind this podium, and we can talk like regular human beings. So briefly, Move to Amend is, as I said, a national, multi-ethnic, multi-racial coalition of affiliates, community organizers, and a national leadership team that is calling for an amendment to the Constitution to say emphatically that corporations are not people, that they should not have the human rights that are intended only for humans, as evidenced by the adjective human before rights, and that money is not speech, which means that corporations should not have the First Amendment right to free speech that they have interpreted as meaning that they get to spend as much money, their way of speaking, in elections as they possibly can. And so we are working to pass an amendment to the Constitution to overturn those 2 doctrines as a first step in creating a genuine democracy. That's the first prong of Move to Amend's plan. The second prong is to create a true participatory, genuine democracy movement and democracy in the United States. And that is a much bigger plan. And so the amendment is our tactic, our way of starting to organize around issues of corporate rule and start fighting for genuine little d democracy and start creating that in our communities and in our regions and in this country so that we can actually have the power culturally, politically, legally, etc., to create the world that we want to see. So Move to Amend is a democracy movement, and we're trying to change the concept of what that means to us. A democracy is not going out and pulling a lever on election day and then waiting again for 2 years to do it the next time. It's not a choice between the dude in the black suit and the dude in the blue suit. It's about making decisions as communities that affect our lives, and it's about people who are impacted by decisions making those decisions. I am a community organizer from Salt Lake City, Utah, right there in the belly of the red beast, and I do a lot of different kinds of work. I did a lot of work as a climate organizer and still do. I work with a group called Peaceful Uprising. We are currently fighting a tar sands mine that's proposed in Utah, amongst other heinous ideas, and I've done a lot of other kinds of organizing work as well. And I'm standing in front of you today because every kind of work that I did ran up against the reality of corporate rule in this country. And I realized that when corporations are more valuable in our minds and in our actual structures of government and structures of society, than me and you and all of us, then our issues don't have a fighting chance. And so I decided to continue to work on those specific issues, as we all need to, but also I decided that I wanted to start working at the root of those problems as well. And hopefully we'll work on the grassroots specific issues, and we'll work on the big structural issues coming down, and we'll meet for a big party in the middle where we actually have the rockin' world that we want to live in. So that's why I'm here, and I hope that you have an equally great reason for being here, and I hope you're tired of corporations ruling over you and making the decisions that you know that you're smart enough and brave enough to make yourself in your communities. And so we want to channel that outrage into organizing and into systemic and sweeping change. And this is a little bit about how we're going to do that. I'll loop back in the end to talking about Move to Amend's specific strategy for how to get an amendment, because I don't know if y'all have heard, but they don't come easy. And so we want to create a movement that's capable of actually creating this kind of change. And hopefully by the end of our discussion and this presentation, you'll understand why these strategies make sense, and you'll understand why we need an amendment in the first place. So I'm going to go into this, this story that I think is very important. And if you have a burning question or a short contribution to the conversation, raise your hand and say it. But if you have a longer, more in-depth kind of question or comment, I love those too, but please save them for the end so that we can get the story and have the meat to kind of discuss when we get there. So let's begin the sordid tale of the dastardly rise of corporate rule in this country. For me, I am 30 years old. True story. And I am telling you that because I think for most people under the age of about 40 or 45, a corporate capitalist system and a corporate controlled government is the only system we've ever really known. And it's the only system that I have known on a broad scale. So it's very easy when you live under a system your whole life to think that that is the only kind of system possible, or that that system is inevitable. But corporate control of our government and a corporate-controlled economy is not inevitable. It's like everything else in this human-made world. It's made by us, right? Or it's made by some of us, and that's the problem. It's created, and if something can be created, it can be uncreated, right? It can be dismantled, it can be changed, and that's a very empowering thing to know about history. All forms of oppression are created, so all forms of oppression can be dismantled. And that's what we're here to do, is figure out how to dismantle the great oppression of corporate rule of our lives. So how do corporations become the things that they are? Let's start this story back where it starts, which is about 500 years ago. And by the way, as a little caveat, whenever I say corporation in this story, I want to be clear that I'm talking about multinational corporations that take over our government and take over our lives and make decisions for us. I'm not talking about the mom and pop business down the street. I'm not talking about people that are trying to make a living by doing something that's worthwhile in their communities. So we're not against people doing that. We're against people doing that at our expense without our consent, right? So just keep that in your mind so you don't think, hey, she doesn't like my bagel business, or whatever it is. I guarantee you I like your bagel business. Let's start this story where it starts about 500 years ago when there were Roman corporations, but we're going to skip that. And I promise you it won't take 500 years to tell this story, but we're going to start 500 years ago when the advent of the corporation came into being. How did it come into being? Well, there's a guy named, well, he wasn't named a king, but there was a certain guy who ruled England, known as the king, and this king in about the 14 and 1500s was having some problems, right? He was a little bit broke. He was broke because he did what a lot of kings do, which is fight foreign wars at his people's expense to increase his riches, right? But instead of increasing his riches, it hadn't treated him so well, and he wasn't doing so hot. And so he thought, how can I make more money? I've already done all the things that I normally do by breaking the backs of the poor, etc., so what can I really do? Meanwhile, in the same land, there were some very wealthy elites, men, in case you're wondering, who decided that they would also like to make a heap of money at some other people's expenses. And in this instance, it was the expenses of people who lived in lands that these men believed that they had discovered, but that had existed just fine before these men ever got there, and that contained valuable resources and large human populations that these men saw as objects of exploitation and wealth. And so they said, well, we want to go out and make some riches off of this new world, but it's a pretty risky business because the last time we checked, people don't really like being taken over, and they don't like having their resources vacuumed out of their countries, and so it's kind of a little dangerous. They might rise up, we might lose ships at sea, we don't know really what to do. So I know, let's go to that king guy. He's always been pretty in favor of what we do. And so they went to the king and they said, we want to go out and we want to earn vast amounts of money by exploiting and extracting resources, and we need your cover, basically. And the king said, well, that's good, because I was just looking for a way to get rich and I wasn't really sure how I was going to do it. So how about we make a deal? I will charter you as something called a corporation. And as a corporation, you can do all sorts of really cool things like live forever and also be protected from liability for the decisions that you make. And in exchange, I'd like a little bit of skimming off of your profits. And they all scratched their heads and hemmed and hawed and then shook hands and said, deal. We're a corporation now, we live forever, we have what's called limited liability, meaning that we don't have to take full responsibility for the actions that we take and the mistakes that we make in case we lose money or ships or there's some kind of insurrection or whatever. And yeah, we'll give you some of our profits. That was the happy birthday to the modern corporation. That was its first breath, right? And the features of this deal are very important because they're going to exist for a long time up to this current minute on this current day of this year, right? And one of them is that the corporate form is a collusion between elites in the government and elites in the economy that is supposedly supposed to benefit both, but actually in the end ends up bankrupting the government and benefiting the economic elites, right? Or they become the same thing. And so that's one feature of corporate rule, right? Of multinational corporate rule. Another feature is when this happened. That's very important too, right? And it happened when a lot of people wanted to go out and exploit and extract resources from other lands. And I want to be very clear that it is not an accident that the modern corporation grew up at the same time as the most massive expansion of globalized exploitation and imperialism that the world had ever seen. It was, in fact, the vehicle for that expansion, and it provided the liability shield and the funds and the wherewithal to basically achieve these ends, right? And so the corporation is basically a concentration vehicle. It makes things more potent, it makes profits more potent, and it makes damage more potent for the people who have to live under this system, right? And so forget whatever you've heard about the free market. The government needs to participate in chartering and creating laws that protect the multinational corporation, right? This is important because we're thinking about structures. If we want to dismantle a structure of corporate rule, we need to know the players involved. And the players involved are political folks, right? And these economic elites. So moving on, we're gonna just run through the next few hundred years until we get to about 1750. And we have a lot of things going on, including that a lot of people who wanted to make a lot of money have come over to the United States, or it was not the United States, but they have come over to this country and set up shop over here to make a lot of money as well. And we also have Cruising the Seas, the most powerful corporation that has ever existed, ever. Does anybody know the name of that corporation? East India Company, yeah, very good. The British East India Company, it makes Walmart look like a toddler in diapers, right? It has the most massive amount of control that the world has ever seen. It has its own court system. It controls giant swaths of land and has brought in entire cultures under its jurisdiction and its control, right? And it also, favorably for it, is funded by members of the British Parliament, right? Almost every member of the British Parliament owns stocks in this corporation. And so what kinds of laws is the British Parliament going to pass when they go and pass laws? Are they going to pass laws that favor common people? Or are they going to pass laws that favor the British East India Company? I think you all made your guess, even though you didn't say it out loud. And yeah, they make laws that favor the British East India Company, right? And a lot of those laws are laws that we learned about in high school civics class that we glossed over in the story that we were told about the American Revolution. And they were glossed over on the way to the most important point for most of high school civics teachers, at least my high school civics teacher, which was that the American Revolution was a revolution for democracy all over the land, for political rights, and that the people got political rights, and we've been singing Kumbaya ever since, right? That's the story that I was told. And that story is false on so many levels, I'm really not even sure where to begin, but we'll begin by saying that all revolutions, that no revolution is just political ever, right? All revolutions are both political and economic because they're fighting a fusion of power that is both political and economic, right? And the corporation is the classic kind of apotheosis of a political and economic vehicle for power. It's the collusion of economic and political might, right? And so when the American Revolution began, there are a lot of people fighting for political rights. They're saying, overthrow the king, overthrow the tyranny of power politically that is known as the king or the monarch, right? And that story has its conclusions, and we'll go into that. But have you ever thought before to yourself, wait a minute, what about the economic side of this revolution? What about the story about people fighting against economic tyranny? And what was that in the form of? That's the question that I started to ask that led me to reading this kind of stuff, that led me to understanding this story, right? And it's important to remember that the American colonies, besides being colonies that existed on indigenous peoples' land and committed genocide against indigenous people, were also actual corporate charters, right? 12 of the 13 colonies in the United States in the colonial period were corporate charters. They were tracts of land given to somebody or a few people or a company to make that company very rich, and they brought over to America the kinds of people who would work for the very rich, namely poor people, people who had gotten out of jail, kids who were walking on the wrong street one day who got swept up in kidnapping raids, indentured servants, and Africans who were enslaved to make the plantations run, essentially, right? So there were all sorts of people who knew the score politically and economically about how power worked because they had basically been the labor force that made this country, right? Or that colonized this country. And so when the American Revolution happened, and there were a lot of people talking about, getting rid of the divine right of kings and talking about monarchy, they were saying, hold on, wait a minute. There are some other issues going on here. There's some other problems that I'd like to bring to the table, and they're decidedly both economic and political, and I would not just like to overthrow the king, I would like to overthrow all forms of concentrated tyranny that have power over my lives. And these people are people we don't hear about because they operated largely in bands with no name, and they were poor, and the rich write history, and so we don't hear about them, but they did some amazing things. And they were active all over in the 13 colonies, and they were so powerful that they set the agenda for a lot of the stuff that happened in Boston and these other seaport towns that we do hear about, right? And they were so radical in their analysis of what needed to change that people in Boston were saying, okay, cool it, Western Massachusetts, cool it, we'll do something. The Boston Tea Party, that's it, that's what we'll do. That was largely a reaction to the kind of organizing that was going on all around the country, led by people who were poor and indentured or women or slaves or whatever fill-in-the-blank group. And it's important because one of the defining acts of the American Revolution that we hear about in school is this Boston Tea Party, right? And we get it inside this story of political rights and political autonomy and political revolutions, and we say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But if you think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense just as a political act, right? Just as an act to overthrow a king. Why would you target the British East India Tea Company sitting in the Boston Harbor? It makes a lot more sense when you realize that corporations like the British East India Tea Company were setting the political agenda for Parliament because Parliament depended on the British East India Tea Company for their stocks and also for their political power at this point, and that those laws were the onerous laws that caused people to make an economic and political resistance movement and rise up against it. So when people throw tea in the Boston Harbor, they aren't just throwing tea saying no more king, they're saying no more form of economic and political tyranny, right? That's not a story that I heard, but it makes that story make a whole lot more sense, right? And so then you have all these other actions, a whole revolutionary war, and then the dust settles, and you have something that's known as the Constitution, right? This is where the story gets very important, and I'm not here to just be like a Debbie Downer that shoots darts into all of your balloons of hope or whatever and says, none of these stories are true. I'm telling this story for a very specific reason, so we understand how to fight against the forms of power that we are facing today, and also to be honest about the people who have suffered at the expense of power in our country's history. And so at the time that the Constitution was twinkling in some people's eyes, we have very distinct groups on the ground. I got a story once again of a bunch of people who all agreed with each other, all wanted the same things, all came to the Constitutional Convention to write a liberty document that would forever change the course of America. But in reality, when you have a revolution against a common enemy, you have a lot of groups, disparate groups with disparate ideals and desires, right, that want to fight together for that moment. But when that enemy is gone, when the revolution is successful, they usually break apart into their respective groups again, right? And that was happening, just like it does everywhere, in the American colonies after the Revolutionary War. And there was once again a whole class of people, a whole group of people that were fighting as they had always been against economic and political power. These people were comprised of small farmers, they were comprised of indentured servants, they were comprised of Africans who had been enslaved, they were women, and they were fighting for what they had been fighting for originally, right? Which was an end to these forms of tyranny. But there were also people whose names we hear about a lot more who had been fighting against the monarchy for a very different reason. And for many of those people, the American Revolution was less of a revolution and more of a middle management coup, right? They were rich men in America who wanted what the rich men in England had, and they didn't like the control that those rich men in England were having over their lives. And when they got rid of those rich men in England's rule over their lives, they actually wanted a lot of the same things as they had been fighting, right? They wanted to consolidate their wealth and power and form a country and a nation and a government that would help them to do that. And so at the time, America was living under the Articles of Confederation, right, which was very different than the Constitution. And these men said, well, we'd really like to do a few things. We'd like to make a lot of money on Western land speculation. We'd like the creditors in the country to be able to make the debtors of the country pay. And we'd like for the stocks that we've bought in the US government to rise and to be actually lucrative, and we'd like a military power that defends our trade, and we'd like to get rich in trade by consolidating across across state lines, and we can't do that under the Articles of Confederation, and we want to do that. And then you have people like Daniel Shays and the debtor class and the farmer class who are saying, we want an end to debt, we want an end to property, we want a radical change in this society, and we want political and economic equality and justice and rights in this government. And those were the tensions going on at the time. And so the richest men in the country went to the Articles of Confederation Congress and they said, we just want to meet and talk about whether or not the Articles of Confederation is actually, meeting the trade needs of this country. Can we do that? Can we meet? And the Articles of Confederation Congress said, all right, sure, and go meet. And so they met, and they met in Philadelphia, and I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist, this is all historical fact. They joined each other, some of the richest men in America, for a secret meeting, the notes of which were not released for many decades. And instead of reforming the Articles of Confederation, they wrote an entirely new document known as the Constitution that changed the entire course of this country, right? And corporate anthropologist Jane Ann Morris calls the Constitution the first NAFTA because it was written in secret by economic elites in order to consolidate trade across territory lines, right? For the express benefit of economic elite interests, right? And that is not what we hear about the Constitution, and I'm not trying to say, woo, look behind the great Oz curtain. I'm trying to say that this document that we normally attribute our democratic ideals to was not actually, in the words of its writers, a democratic document. It was an economic document designed to consolidate wealth. And when people brought that document back to the people for ratification, which was done very quickly with not a lot of education, the people who had been fighting for a broader political and economic justice said, no way, we just fought an entire war with y'all, and this is what you bring to us, we're not buying it. And so if you want this ratified by the states, you got to do a bunch of things, including amend 10 amendments to this document, call it the Bill of Rights, and give us a basic modicum of human rights that are protected from intrusions by the state. And that is the story of how we got what we call the Bill of Rights, right? The first 10 amendments to the Constitution that protect very basic things, very basic political rights for human beings, right? Like, name some of them. What do they protect? Freedom of speech, press and religion, assembly, freedom from search and seizure, right? What, sorry? Firearms, yeah. Privacy, right? So very important things. And I told this story because when I talk about democracy and the history of American democracy, I'm actually really talking about the Bill of Rights mostly, right? I'm talking about the Bill of Rights, and I'm talking about the sentiments expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that people are created equal, right? Well, men, but that people are created equal, and that we all have an equal say and right to participate in our government, and that we should be protected from forms of tyranny, right? And those ideas contained in the Declaration of Independence are hypocritical, and they were written hypocritically, like most great documents are. And so the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights are unfinished stories, always to be continued stories of political rights in this country, right? So they're the political side of the resistance. They give political rights and political expressions of equality to people, and people fought really hard for those documents. And the history of the United States, as the historian and activist Molly Ivins has said, can be seen as the history of whole masses of people who were not included in that Declaration of Independence or that Constitution or that Bill of Rights the first time around, organizing to drive themselves into that document to count as legal persons, right? Because if you are a legal person in this country, you get access to the Bill of Rights, and you are accorded more of the sentiments expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So being a person is a pretty awesome thing to be. But does anybody want to guess, even after the Bill of Rights was amended to the Constitution, how many people counted as people in this country? In other words, how many people actually got the protection of those Bills of Rights? What percentage? 5%? We've got a very good, yeah, so it's actually between 8 and 10% of the population. So in the Occupy movement, we talk about the 99%. This is straight up the 90% of people who did not count politically in this country. And our country, when I talk about the good things about the United States, I'm talking about those people who said, wait a minute, I know how to do math. I should be in that 100%, and I'm going to form a movement to do that. And I'm talking about the people who wrote the Bill of Rights because they wanted protections against violence and tyranny. And I'm talking about the expressions, very unfinished expressions in the Declaration of Independence. I'm actually not talking that much about the Constitution. And that doesn't mean that the Constitution doesn't have good things in it, or doesn't have important things in it. What it does mean is that a lot of people whose names that we don't really hear or know fought really hard for us to get the protections that we actually enjoy now, and that I believe that we have to honor them by recognizing how they got those rights, and that we have a lot of stuff to continue in the form of work, right? Work as activists and organizers and people in this country. And so that's the political side of it, right? We create the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights applies to persons, and it gives us some political autonomy and political protections in this country. And we're going to loop back to that, but just remember in your brain that being a person, a legal person in the United States is a pretty awesome thing to be, right? Because it protects you, and it gives you the rights that humans deserve. We'll hold off on that for a second, because we got to go back to the other side of the American Revolution, which was a fight against economic tyranny in the form of the multinational corporation. So what happened to that? The document of the Constitution was an economic consolidation document, kind of honestly a counter-revolution to the American Revolution, and it codified the interests of the elite by and large. So what was the people's movement for economic rights in this country? And that is the story I definitely never heard in high school, or since. I had to seek it out, and I always think the information you have to seek out is the most valuable because somebody doesn't want you to know it. And so there is a very, very proud and interesting history in this country of what happened after the Constitution and Bill of Rights went into effect in our country to protect people from economic forms of tyranny in the form of the corporation. And the dust had just settled on this war, and people said, oh no, I remember the British East India Company, and I am quite interested in not going down that path again. So what can we do in our communities to protect us from the ravages of giant corporations? In other words, democracy politically is about who decides, who makes decisions, right? The people, a king, a middle management, who? And economic democracy is about who decides what happens economically in our communities. Corporations, the people, somebody else, some other entity. And people firmly came down on the side of the people decide. And we need to create very clear people's laws that actually demarcate the bounds of the corporation. These were not a bunch of anti-capitalists who were doing their thing. I don't want to confuse what these people were about, right? They were about making some money. They wanted to have some industry. They wanted to have businesses, but they didn't want corporations saying how they did that, right? Or taking over their government. And so they said, we're going to make some laws. So they went to the state legislature and they made a bunch of really profound laws. And I'll just go through them really quickly, and then we'll kind of go back to the end of our story and wrap up. But let's compare it really quickly to what you have to do today. Today, does somebody want to be somebody who wants to charter a corporation? Our villain, just kidding. But does somebody just raise your hand if you want to be a corporation charterer tonight? Anyone? No. Okay, so we have David. So David's going to go and charter a corporation. I am from Utah. I'm not from Portland, so I don't know the exact rules here, but I'll just give you the Utah rules, and they should suffice. You want to go and charter a corporation, what do you have to do? Great. You fill out some forms, write some bylaws, and in Utah, I believe you pay $50 and you're a corporation. And when you are a corporation, what are you allowed to do? Right, anything you want, right? And how long do you, as this corporation, live? Do you have a death date, or? So you live forever. You can do anything you want, you live forever, you pay $50, you get going. Can you own other corporations? Do you have to pay attention to the will of the people and what they want in the society, or just your stockholders? Right, so I think I maybe heard that it's actually a legal requirement for you to only consider the shares of your stockholders and not the public. Am I right? Okay, so you're all about your stockholders, and thanks to all sorts of different perks and benefits, you can do all sorts of things to influence the media and the government and to get your way in communities, right? Sounds pretty sweet. Okay, well, fine. This saucy corporation over here. So David has personified very well our problem. Thank you, David. Let's go back to late 1700s, early 1800s America, the first 75 years of this country. Does anybody know what you had to do to charter a corporation at that time? You had to go to the state legislature and you had to prove to them that you were chartering a corporation that would benefit the public good. Just let that sink in for a second. Take all the multinational corporations you know right now and see what ones are still standing when you apply just that criterion to them. Not very many, right? They had to prove that they served the public good. If they could prove they served the public good, they got a charter. But the charter was essentially a law. The state legislature said, we will pass a bill that says you can exist. And you can't live forever, by the way, because that would be really, really dangerous, because we're going to die and we don't know what you're going to do. So you can only live for a certain amount of time. So at that time, charters lasted anywhere from 3 to 50 years. People were most suspicious of banks, surprise, surprise, and bank charters were 3 to 7 years. The longest charters were for mining corporations, and they were 50 years. That means that they built in a lifespan for a corporation, and after that, the corporation either stopped existing or they had to go back to the legislature and say, how about another round? Can I have another charter? Imagine Goldman Sachs after the financial crisis coming back to the people of the United States with their begging bowl and saying, please, sir, can I have another charter? Do you think that we would have given them that? I certainly hope not, right? So it was another built-in way of proving that you were actually benefiting people and the community that you were a part of. Another thing is they had all sorts of rules. So a corporation can only make a certain amount of money, and then it was returned into the public hands. Corporations could only, unlike David's corporation, they could only do a very specific activity that they stated beforehand instead of just doing whatever they wanted. They could not own other corporations because people wanted to keep them small. Their board members and their shareholders had to be local usually, not beyond the state in their jurisdiction. And they had to have their books open to the public so people could see what they were up to and see what they were doing and who they were meeting with and what they were selling to whom. And maybe most impressive from our vantage point is that until 1848 in several states, it was actually a felony for a corporation to donate a single penny to elections. Pretty crazy, right? So it's not crazy. Pretty sane, right, is what I meant to say. So you can see, like a corporation sitting in a jail, like, what are you in here for? Oh, I donated more than a penny to an election, and, they got me. So people exercised a tremendous amount of power over their economic lives at that time. Were things perfect? No. Was there equality between all people? No. Did we have a long way to go? For sure. But did people have a pretty good system down for saying who decides economically in a society? Yeah. It wasn't this regulatory alphabet soup that we have now where you're like, the DOE on the 7th Tuesday of, never can make this law for these corporations in this instance, and then maybe you'll breathe a little bit less poisoned air, right? No, it was a clear act of economic sovereignty by people to control what happened in their communities and to keep the economy people-centric, right? And that was pretty awesome. And the last part of our story is what happened, right? So did anybody know that story of the first 75 years of this country? Anyone? Awesome. How does that make you feel knowing that? You don't have to be like, great, actually, you can tell me your honest responses, but how do you feel learning that story that you hadn't heard before?
Back to the past.
What?
Back to the past.
Back to the past. All right, follow this guy back to the past after the meeting. Cool, so it's pretty inspiring, right?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I put a metal bar around the necks of corporations and have them heal to the people.
Cool, all right. So people deciding again. I love this outrage. This is great. So I found that story very empowering because it was a story, once again, going back to our initial idea of dismantling power. If power is created, power can be dismantled, and power can be recreated in a way that serves people, right? And so I think that the early people of the United States had some pretty rad ideas. We don't have to go back to that exact world. We could take a page from them. We could do everything they did and more, whatever. The point is not necessarily like they did it exactly right. The point is that they had conversations about who decided, and they created a world that was pretty simple, using just their own brains about how to do this better than we're doing it right now, right? And corporations didn't like it very much. And so corporations, as they got bigger and bigger, said, oh, I need a little bit more elbow room here. I want to make more money, but I can't do it. I can't do it. So what did they do? They went to the legislatures and they said, hey, you got to loosen these restrictions. We really don't like them, these corporate CEOs and lawyers, right? And the legislatures were like, why would I listen to you? You don't buy my elections, so I don't really see a point in loosening these restrictions for you, so no. See ya. And they didn't have a lot of success there, right? I mean, there's always a country club where rich people talk, and that worked to a certain extent, but by and large, it didn't work very well. And so they came back with their tails between their legs, but not for long, and they said, what do we need? We need to figure out a way that corporations can gain a tremendous amount of power in a very small amount of time. And they said, well, first of all, what we need is a war. And just their luck, they happened to get one, the American Civil War, in case you're keeping track at home, right? Which was a war fought over a lot of things, including, for some people, the issue of slavery, right? And when that war was over, we had a very profound series of amendments that passed that basically formalized the entry of African Americans into this country as legal persons, something that everybody should have always known because they were always persons, but it was a move to formalize them as legal persons in the United States so that they would get the protections of the Bill of Rights. And the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments emancipated Africans from slavery and gave African men the right to vote, and it also gave them the 14th Amendment, which was an amendment that says that all laws have to essentially treat people equally, right? Equal protection of the laws, due process of the laws. You can't treat a certain class of people different because of something that's different about them from this other group of people, right? And so it was an act of great political equality and a great stride forward in our country to include people who should have been included the first time around in our founding documents, right? And corporations said, ooh, I want that. I just remembered, you guys, it's really awesome to be a person in the United States because then you get all these rights. And if we got rights, we're so powerful, and we could get even more powerful, that we could basically use that leverage to basically control decisions in this country. Ooh, we gotta have that. And luckily for those corporations, they'd spent that wartime getting extremely wealthy by providing railroad transport and banking services for the war. And so banking tycoons and railroad people were some of the most powerful people out at that time. And they said, forget the legislature. We're not doing it anymore. We got to get rights of persons, and we got to do it by going to the branch of government that is the most distant, the most unanswerable to the people, and frankly, the most boring. Sorry for any of you lawyers out there. I'm talking about the Supreme Court, right? Not many Americans are glued to court TV saying, like, what will happen next in the case of so-and-so versus some very boring topic, you know? And so they knew that people weren't following along with that, and they said, we're going to go there. And they went to the courts, and they said, they brought these cases about really boring stuff. Trust me, if you ever need help sleeping, read through some of these cases. That's what I did. It really improved my sleep life. But they brought really boring cases that said, hey, don't tax these railroad fences over here, and you can tax them over here. And by the way, we're people under the law. Yeah, we're people under the law. And what they used to argue that was the 14th Amendment. You have to realize how cynical that is. They took one of the greatest strides forward for human rights and justice in the United States and used it for themselves. And they said, we're people under the law. And because we're people, you can't treat us any differently than other people either. And absurdly, the Supreme Court bought their argument. And in 1886, in a case that was actually never formally argued, but kind of just got into the head notes by some random string of events, the Supreme Court said, okay, you're people. You, corporations, you're people under the law. But as we know, corporation is nothing like a person. And if a corporation can, as they then could, live forever, as they then were able to do, live forever and amass massive amounts of money and control public opinion and do whatever they want and make whatever they want and pay people whatever they want to make those things, then they have tremendous and dangerous amounts of power in our society, and yet they're given equal treatment to us as human beings. What happens to democracy when that happens? It's over, right? It's over for regular people like you and me. And so that's what the corporations did. And they got 14th Amendment rights in that decision. And what does that mean, right? For everybody who's not a fancy lawyer in our midst, right? What does it mean? It means that if a corporation, like a coal corporation, for example, or an oil refinery wanted to move into your town, and you as a community said, we don't want to breathe that toxic air, we don't want to warm our climate, we don't want this corporation in our town burning fuel, right? We don't want it. Can we just say we don't want it? The corporation would say, sure, you can go ahead and say you don't want it, but we're going to come back and sue you under the 14th Amendment because that would be discriminating against us as people if you don't allow us into your community. So that's the 14th Amendment, right? And then that wasn't enough for them, and they kept going, and they said, we want other amendments too. And so they got the Fourth Amendment, which is a protection against search and seizure. That's why, ostensibly, we were talking earlier, and somebody mentioned very accurately that this doesn't actually protect us a whole lot anymore, right? But ostensibly, the government is not supposed to barge in on you and your property without a warrant, right? And the corporations wanted that, and they argued in court, and they got that, and they used it to say, even if you pass a democratically enacted law in your town, even if you do that, we're going to say that you can't enforce it. When the OSHA guy or the EPA woman or whatever comes and says, hey, are you actually following these rules that people wrote? We'll say, oh, you can't come and check on our labor practices or our environmental practices unless you have a warrant. Go back and get a warrant and we'll be happy to talk to you because we have privacy rights. And then when the OSHA person comes back and says, I have a warrant, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, look at our happy land of workers who are being treated so well and who are loving their jobs. Right? So it gets in the way of people actually enforcing democratically enacted opinions, right? And then they got Fifth Amendment rights, which is protection against the government taking your property. It says if the government takes your property, they have to pay you for it, right? And corporations have used this to argue that if you pass any kind of labor or environmental law that infringes on their profits, AKA any effective law, right, that is a takings against that corporation. You've taken their property, their current and their future profits, and they can sue the city for all the profits they were making or would have made doing that work. So what cities are going to be brave enough to say, let's stand up and bankrupt ourselves by passing effective laws if they know corporations can come back and sue them for that, right? And so they got those rights. And the point of these rights is to say they were overruling, through the court system, people's democratic rights to make decisions that protect their communities and help their communities to thrive economically and democratically, right? They were overruling those people because they were people too now. And finally, in the 1970s, they said, great, we've been getting some good rights, but we're just not satisfied. What we'd really like is the right that most Americans are talking about when they say what it means to be an American, when they talk about freedom, right? It was the right I was referring to when I would argue with my mom when I was a teenager and be like, it's a free country, I can say whatever I want. The freedom of speech, right? The freedom to express your opinions. There could be nothing more central to a democratic society than that right, right? And the corporations wanted that because they knew with their wealth and their size and their power and their control of the media and the government, if they could speak, ain't nobody could listen to anybody else, right? And so they said, we want that right. And they spent 30 years getting it. And there were a lot of decisions along the way, but in 2010, the Supreme Court decided in a case called Citizens United versus the FEC that corporations, because of a previously decided court case that said corporations have the right to freedom of speech, but wait a minute, they're not people, so what does that mean? That should have made us pause, right? But we're like, no, we got to give them a mouth somehow. What are we going to do? They speak by spending money. That's how they speak. That's their freedom of speech, right? And therefore, if we pass any law that abridges their right to speak freely, in other words, to spend unlimited amounts of money in our elections, we are impinging on their freedom of speech rights. And that's why in the last couple of years, you've seen elections just blow up. Millions to billions of dollars of secret cash coming from who knows where, controlling and buying off all of our politicians, right? That's because corporations have First Amendment rights. So that's what they've done about it. And that's where we are now. And that's a depressing story, and I don't like depressing stories, and so I want to tell you a non-depressing response to that, right? Which is, we have once again been put in a situation where we are being controlled democratically and economically by elites who do not have our interests at heart. And those elites have combined in the form of corporate rule, using our court system, our legislative system, and our executive system against us to consolidate their wealth at our expense. And they are keeping us from actually responding as a successful movement by denying us most of our political rights or by drowning out our voices with their ability to speak and act. And so if we are going to fight this fusion of economic and political tyranny, we are going to have to come up with a movement that is capable of economic and political resistance, right? And that's where Move to Amend comes in, and also that's where all y'all's fights come in. I'm sure there are people in this audience who are doing awesome work in immigration or environmental justice or in food or in labor. It's all of our fights, right, to create a democratic society. And notice I'm not saying restore, and that's very important, because for 90% of people from the jump, and for most people in American history, there is not a democracy to restore. They were not included in the first go-around. There were some good ideas, but they weren't included, right? And so what we are trying to do is create a genuine, just, participatory democracy in the United States that centralizes and forefronts the concerns of people who have been oppressed by our corporate political system and corporate economic system, right? And if we're going to do that, we have to fight back with political and economic might. And so what are we going to do about it? And so that's where Move to Amend comes in on the structural level. And Move to Amend says, well, first of all, and I hope this makes more sense than it did when we said it at the beginning, we are going to have to create a movement to amend the Constitution of the United States to overrule the Supreme Court, because that's the only way that you overrule those dudes in black robes, right? You gotta pass an amendment because they're appointed for life, they make decisions, and they're not making decisions for us anymore, right? They're corporate bought and paid for most part too. So we have to overrule the court and amend the US Constitution. And that's a really big fight, right? And we have to do that by saying corporations are not people and money is not speech. So that's the first prong of Move to Amend's plan to do that. And this is the way we're doing it. We know that it's really hard to amend the US Constitution, and we know that it was made that way for a reason, so that it wouldn't be easy to do it for people like us, right? And so we're saying that we need to take a page from past social movements and build up a grassroots base that is strong enough, educated enough, and mobilized enough to push this into a Congress that is basically the polarity of our interests, right? Remembering that when abolitionists went to Congress to pass an amendment emancipating and protecting African American rights and ending slavery, they were going into a slaveholder-dominated Congress, right? And when women went into Congress to demand an amendment for the right to vote and for women's suffrage and equality, they were going into an exclusively male-owned Congress, right? And when people in the civil rights movement or the farm worker struggles movements or whatever movement you want to fill into the blank went into Congress to get their rights, they went into a Congress that was by and large controlled by interests that were expressly the opposite of theirs. And why were they successful then? Why did that work? At least partially, right? All of these movements are also unfinished. It's not like the only thing that women wanted was the right to vote. And it's not like the only thing that African American people wanted was the right to vote. So these are unfinished fights, but they went in and they made it happen by creating an unstoppable movement. And that's what Move to Amend wants to do. So we're not just going to Congress with our begging bowl and saying, hey, will you give us an amendment, and getting smacked down by them, right? We're building a base. And doing that by saying, join one of our 150 affiliates across the country, or create your own if there's not one where you live, but you probably all live here. I imagine you don't commute to social justice presentations. So there is one here and you can be part of it. And what we are doing in our affiliates across the country is we're passing resolutions largely by ballot initiative where that's available. And so we're saying that we collect signatures to put an issue on the ballot, and the issue says, we the people of Portland, for example, Portland's actually already passed a resolution, but we the people of Portland demand that Congress passes an amendment to the Constitution saying corporations aren't people and money isn't speech. And they organize and they educate and they mobilize, and then people go and vote on that issue. And then they take it to more cities, and then they take it to the county level, and then they take it to more counties, and then they take it to the state level. And eventually you have states across the country passing statewide ballot initiatives or statewide legislative demands and resolutions that say, Congress, get on it, pass this. And by the time 2/3 of those states are calling for this, we have a populace that is educated and mobilized and powerful enough to actually make this a reality. And that's our plan. So far, we've had 500 cities across the country in 2 years pass these resolutions. A lot of those have happened by ballot initiative, and a lot of those have Move to Amend's specific language. Some of them only address Citizens United. And we have 150 affiliates doing this work, and more coming on board every day, and we're starting to move to the states in some of these areas as well. So that's our strategy there. The second prong of Move to Amend's plan is to build a genuine democracy movement. And that's just not a chummy thing to say, everybody sit down at the table. We're deadly serious about it. We recognize the history of this country as a history of oppression against minoritized and exploited groups by people in power. And we know that those oppressions took political form in the form of the Constitution in people who weren't included the first time, and in the form of all sorts of things that have happened since. And we want to build a movement that is honest about that centralizes and forecasts the concerns of those groups, and that builds a society that would actually solve for the issues that those groups are facing, right? So we're not just about passing an amendment. If we pass an amendment tomorrow, nothing would change on the ground practically, because the amendment is just a grounds for work to be done, right? It's just a way of allowing us to do the work that needs to be done. So we need to have massive conversations about the kind of world, as the question was asked earlier, we want to replace this corporate-dominated world with. What new laws do we need? We just took down a big machine, right? What beautiful thing are we building? What structures are we building to protect what kinds of things? And we need to start talking about that. So Move to Amend is expressly about collaborating with groups on the local and regional and national level to start having these conversations formally and informally about what kind of world we want to make, and supporting each other in our struggles to make them on the ground now. And we are working to start collaborating with the U.S. Social Forum to do people's movement assemblies to talk about what would have to change about the Constitution and the laws in this country to make them adequate for justice, right? And so for me, it goes back finally to the idea of the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. The trade interests in this country said, we want to go and have a little meeting about whether the Articles of Confederation is adequate to our interests and to trade in this country, and they formed the Constitution. And what I think that we need to do now is to get together and say, we want to have a big conversation where everybody is included, where we talk about whether the laws and the documents and the culture of this country is adequate to justice and adequate to the kind of work that we need to do to create the world that we want. And that conversation is going to be long and intense and messy and beautiful and worth it. And that's what we also want to provoke at Move to Amend as well. So that is my story of power and corporations and democracy. And I'm here because I want to be part of a movement that's trying to create democracy in this country, and I hope that you all do too. An amendment to Congress. They introduced it 3 weeks ago. It's sponsored by Representatives Pocan and Nolan in Madison, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, respectively. And the amendment says money is not speech and corporations are not people, and it's really exciting. But we want to be very, very clear that because of all the reasons that hopefully became clear in the story that I just told, we are still about a grassroots movement. I said earlier today that we did that to reserve our spot on this big dance card that's going to happen real soon, right? And we're pushing for that, but our focus is building the type of movement that cannot just pass this amendment, but is actually capable of sustaining the changes that this kind of amendment, entails. So we want to build a society that's different enough to handle the difference that we're demanding. And so our focus is not on Congress. Our focus is on reintroducing that to Congress while we do real grassroots movement building that then makes this amendment inevitable.